By the time I was in grad school, I was doing physics for my doctorate. And I also had been driven screaming from the wet lab because I was a terrible bench scientist. And so I figured out, okay, I should be doing theory, and I'll do theory, do biophysics. After I started grad school, I got much more interested in being a Jew. I'm living in Israel now and have been for years. At some point, probably just for practical use in the home and stuff, I got ordination as an Orthodox rabbi. There are different kinds of things you can decide you want to do in science. Some of them are more like you're trying to build real estate that's adjacent to other existing real estate and become a part of a community. And then there are other times where maybe what you're doing is more like going out in the middle of a wilderness and planting a stake. And I think there's something healthy about going through periods of each of those things. Who is God? What does this word mean when the text uses it? And it's not meant to be obvious or easy to understand. And in fact, it's meant to be a process of study where you learn the meaning of that word from its use in context, from the rest of the Torah, and from process it is supposed to involve, among other things, like studying the law and trying to live in the world according to the law.
On this episode of the 632 Nanometer podcast, traverse the non-equilibrium dynamics landscape of Jeremy England's life and ideas during Mike's visit to his home office in Israel. As a professor at MIT, Jeremy helped reframe the origin of life debate as a problem in driven statistical mechanics. This opened the possibility of understanding the very existence of life, a highly ordered form of matter in a universe that is supposed to trend towards disorder from the perspective of fundamental physics, rather than chemistry, biology, or religion. England walks us through the birth and the technical details of his dissipative adaptation work. Think of it as natural selection, but in the chemical and thermodynamic space, no DNA needed, which led him to becoming a minor celebrity hailed by the press as the second Darwin, and included in Dan Brown's novel Origin as the scientist that proves the non-existence of God, much to Jeremy's chagrin as a deeply religious man and a recently ordained rabbi. The conversation doesn't stop at physics. By hour 2, Mike and Jeremy are knee-deep in Exodus, discussing the duality of existence, the modern reimagination of religion that is burning man, and the possibility of applying dissipative adaptation principle to computing, AI, aging science, and more.
If somebody makes a top 10 list of the big questions, for example, how does the human brain work? What happened before the Big Bang? What is dark matter? One of the top 10 for most people was the origin of life. How did you end up tackling this from, kind of like an analytical and physics perspective, where normally people are looking at it from more of a chemistry and biology perspective? And can you explain on a semi-technical level the concept of dissipative adaptation that you came up with?
Sure. So I think telling the story of how I personally got drawn into thinking about the origins of life, or let's say the physics of life-likeness. I could start at a few different places. In one sense, I was always really interested in both biology and physics. Like, I think I always loved about theory in physics that you could make a small number of very precisely stated assumptions and then derive implications from them that ended up explaining a lot of different phenomena that seem initially perhaps to be very unrelated or disparate. I became very impressed by those successes of theoretical physics early on in my studies. But I also think biology held this different fascination because it was about the emergence of form and function, like that when you break living things into their constituent atoms, if you look at each atom or each molecule, like a small molecule, all it can really do is rotate and vibrate and bounce off of things. And there isn't a sense of purpose in that. But once you get up even just to the level of a protein, you can say, what is this protein for? It's for catalyzing this reaction. It's for carrying oxygen in the blood or whatever else. And I think my first exposure to the molecular picture of how biology works really was very intriguing in that regard. And so for a long time, I got interested in this question of how do you operate at the boundary and say, how does physics help us to better understand what makes life tick and how it works? And that was where I was initially. Like, I did my first degree in biochemistry, but I was already actually studying a bunch of physics at the time on the sly. It was sort of a way I could take the physics I wanted to without having to take the part I didn't want, but still get a degree. And so, but then by the time I was in grad school, I was doing physics for my doctorate. And I also had been driven screaming from the wet lab because I was a terrible bench scientist. And so I figured out, okay, I should be doing theory, and I'll do theory, do biophysics. And for a long time, that meant grabbing onto pieces of biology that seemed to do something really striking and saying, all right, how do we explain this? Like I did a lot of work starting as an undergraduate, but carrying on through grad school and postdoc and into when I started my group at MIT in the physics department, was doing a lot of stuff with protein folding and what's called structural biology. So understanding the physics of how macromolecules get their shapes, and of course their shapes given their function. So it's particularly useful from a biological perspective to understand that physics problem. But when you notice about that is that that's starting with the biological phenomenon is given, and then saying, all right, how do we put the lens of physics on this? How do we break this down and look at it in terms of measurements of distance and time and energy and mass and whatever, like basic physical quantities, think in terms of thermodynamics, condensed matter theory, whatever. How do you explain something that you take for granted is functionally important in the biological context? But that, is not the same question as one that I think as time went on, I got more and more drawn into, which is, you think about many examples of this. Okay, this protein folds this way, or this developmental process happens by this kind of signaling mechanism. And it's always cool and interesting, but then eventually you kind of say, but how did it get this way? Like why, I understand given these initial conditions, why the matter behaves the way that it does, but how can I understand from the standpoint of physics how the matter would have gotten in those initial conditions? Because biological initial conditions are exquisitely specialized and seemingly non-random. And so there is always this question of, when do you get this kind of organization of matter and when do you not? Why would it emerge in a certain condition? Or when is it forbidden from emerging? Why is it permitted to emerge by thermodynamics? Those kinds of things, I think, as I matured in my studies, got to be more and more interesting to me. And so by the time I was doing my postdoc at Princeton, I was starting to ask myself a question, but I didn't really have like a formal way of approaching it, of just something more content on the sides, which is what are the physical requirements to be a self-replicator? Like, are there rules according to the laws of thermodynamics, which generally tend to be these, very hard rules to break? They're, easy to show that they apply in a broad range of circumstances. Could it be the case that there are some situations where you're allowed to have self-replicators in the system thermodynamically, and in another case, you're not allowed to have them? I got kind of curious about that question. I think it maybe was part of some kind of proposal I wrote when I remember when I was applying to MIT, but then I didn't even know what to do to think about that question initially. And so even for the first couple of years I was at MIT, I was still kind of like mulling that, maybe not a couple of years, maybe the first year. But then I think what really happened was I got reconnected with theoretical literature that I'd encountered when it was first coming out in the late 90s, and that had been continuing to make progress, in the interim, kind of in the ensuing decade between then and when I started as a professor, where it's about how do you just deal with the general statistical mechanics of non-equilibrium systems. And that was something that, as it had experienced this sort of renaissance or this...
Had people tried to figure this out in the 19th century, like the heyday of thermodynamics?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing to look at in its own right. You say, all right, thermodynamics, equilibrium thermodynamics, statistical thermodynamics, the classic sort. We get the first major results in the 19th century, and then there's plenty of progress going up through into the early and mid 20th century, and generally you're dealing mostly with systems where the assumption is it's in some heat bath, right? Like, I don't know, we have a picture here. So if there's a heat bath with inverse temperature beta or with temperature T, that's like a big collection of matter with lots of energy it's sharing around. and then you sort of ignore it and assume it's sort of a random fluctuating bath. And then you're interested in some system sitting inside that, but you assume you wait a long time, that energy exchange happens for a really long time, and you can just worry about what's called equilibrium properties, like the probability of the system being in a certain state after a long time just depends on the energy of the state. There's something called the Boltzmann distribution that we have here. That there's an exponential relationship between energy and probability that's controlled by the temperature. And you get so focused on thinking about, okay, what's the probability of the state that I'm in? It has to do with this local property in my state, the energy that I have. And that's an incredibly powerful general theoretical framework. You can use it to study lots of systems, explain lots of phenomena and equilibrium. And then when you get into non-equilibrium systems, meaning systems that maybe have tide varying forces on them, maybe have not been allowed to relax the equilibrium, like they recently were prepared in a particular state and they're sort of rolling downhill in energy while fluctuating. Variety of different reasons that you could be non-equilibrium. You have an electrical current passing through the system. You have matter going in one form and leaving the system in another form in some kind of current or flow. Lots of different ways you could have non-equilibrium system, and certainly living things are non-equilibrium systems, we know.
I mean, the interesting thing is that even heat engines, which is what the whole thermodynamics kind of cottage industry came out of, right? In science, even those are not really at equilibrium.
Right. They're useful because we use them as part of a non-equilibrium process of running an engine and spinning a wheel. But we could understand them at the time because you could break the heat engine's duty cycle into different shifts between different equilibria as you sort of compress a gas or let it expand. And so by knowing the equilibrium properties of gases, et cetera, you could explain it all. But yeah, it's a great point. The key thing then is, how do you start to make sense of what should happen in a system where there is a non-equilibrium condition? The Boltzmann distribution cannot be derived. It doesn't apply. And I think what part of, in some ways what they made progress on, let's say in the early 20th century or up to the mid 20th century, is what's called the linear regime, where you're still pretty close to equilibrium, or you have weak perturbations, and then equilibrium properties are useful for making predictions about non-equilibrium effects, where it's about kinetics, it's about how things evolve over time.
But what makes it linear? Why do they use the word linear?
So it actually can mean a couple different things that end up being related. So one notion of linear response is that I'm not driving the system very hard. And so if I apply a weak perturbation to a system, then whatever happens in it is going to be something I can do a kind of Taylor expansion in the strength of what I'm doing to the system, and I can throw away the higher order effects. And the leading order effects are easy to compute often based on properties that you know about the system from an equilibrium theory. So even though you're asking a dynamical question, it's like the dynamics are somehow a product of the equilibrium properties of the system and some sort of leading order effects.
So this is like you have a bucket of water and you heat it from one point or something like that. Or a bucket of atoms, like a gas in a jar, and you have one hot.
Well, yeah. So
for example,
or maybe like an easy one, things that are related to some of your early results in non-equilibrium dynamic. You think about like a spectroscopic situation, right, where you're applying a field at a certain frequency into a system. So that's a non-equilibrium drive. And then you're interested in some kind of response of the system to that driving. And the question is, can you calculate that by knowing things about the equilibrium properties and then just how you're driving it? Obviously, if you drive a system too strongly, the equilibrium properties are irrelevant because you've driven it far away from equilibrium. It's in a different state. So that's one sense in which linearity matters. Also, a related thing is there was this set of results called the Onsager relations, where basically it's like Newton's third law realized for statistical thermodynamics, where what you realize is that if there are certain kinetic properties for how things change, if your system is, if you're looking at linearity in the sense of a small perturbation away from equilibrium itself, then you can demonstrate there are these constraining relations where it's sort of like the kinetic coefficient governing how one property of a system responds to a force of one kind has to be related to the sort of running it in reverse thing, where you look at how the response happens when you push on the other thing first. And and see how the second thing responds. But all that was, I don't know, I want to say like 50s, maybe eventually in the 60s, people were starting to do things that were reaching towards other stuff. And then I think part of the reason historically it got paused is that one way of looking at thermodynamics is macroscopic, and that was how it was born. When you're looking at heat engines, no one was talking about, microstates and their probabilities. They were just talking about what's the temperature, or what's the enthalpy, what the entropy, and those were things you could define in macroscopic terms. But if you tried to develop a theory of non-equilibrium thermodynamics using macroscopic variables, it gets very airy. It's like hard. I haven't seen progress in that direction that really lands somewhere, because what we have now done is made progress in the microscopic arena. And when you see how that progress is made, it seems kind of hard to imagine how you would have handled that if you tried to stay macroscopic. So I think that's part of the reason. And so there were some disappointing forays in the direction of trying to make a non-equilibrium thermodynamics, like Elie Prigogine, a Nobel laureate chemistry, was famous for pushing on that. But I think for a few decades, it felt to people like it didn't really lead anywhere, or maybe there were results people were kind of ignoring. Like there was a paper by these guys, Boshkov and Kuzelev in the Soviet Union in the 70s, where they had nearly the same results as what eventually really blew things wide open in the 90s. But it was sort of, buried in a long paper with lots of other results. And no one was doing numerical simulations at the time because computers weren't good enough yet. So it was hard to test. And it was also, not clear that anyone necessarily appreciated the value of what they'd come across. And one could get into more details of what was different there. So it's sort of like someone who had a Picasso at their garage sale and sold it for $10, not realizing it, or something like that. But then, in the late 90s, you have Chris Jasinski and Gavin Crooks coming up with these results, where I think the major realization was you need to stop talking about the probabilities of states, and you need to start talking instead about the probabilities of trajectories. So, if you look, here at the Boltzmann distribution, there's like a probability that's proportional to this exponential, the energy of a state then the system could be in. And you might have thought, well, now what I want is a generalization of that. But what's the probability of my state in non-equilibrium? So you can write such a generalization, but it's very hard to write before you realize the more fundamental thing is dynamical trajectories. So there's the Jasinski result that was about kind of more like an experimental setup where you apply a time varying field and you measure how much work you do. And he showed that it was related to the equilibrium free energy work that you would do if you did the process very slowly and in a very interesting way. But what really got things down to the microscopics in a way that you could apply in a lot of different ways was this result from Gavin Crooks. So the idea is that instead of relating energy to state probability, you relate heat to trajectory probability. So if there's a total heat Q that you're going to expel into the heat bath over the course of a whole dynamical trajectory x of t under some protocol where you're driving with some time varying field lambda of t, then that turns out to be equal to the ratio of the probability of the forward trajectory to the probability of some time reverse trajectory. And I'm glossing over various details here in terms of, all right, is your time varying field time symmetric or not? Do your states have momentum, or are they, non time symmetry reversed? And so there are,
What do you think there is? So just a basic questions. What's beta there? What's Q?
Yeah. So beta is the inverse temperature. So it's 1 over kBT. In other words, it's 1 over the energy scale associated with your temperature and your heat bath. This lambda is, you're imagining there's some like external force that you're varying over time, or, a parameter that describes the energy function of your system that you're varying over time. Q is heat that's going out in the bath. So the idea is, like, let's say your system is, I don't know, a block of wood on a table. A lambda is varying time, so you're sliding the block of wood back and forth. there's going to be friction to the table. That's going to produce heat. The heat is going to go out into the surrounding heat bath, and that would be Q going out into the bath. And the point is that in that kind of a frame, what you now can talk about is, all right, I'm wobbling the block back and forth this way, and there's some probability of seeing a certain motion. Now, what's the probability of seeing the time reversed motion of the block if I ran that forcing backwards? And the breaking of that time symmetry turns out to be thermodynamically related to the amount of heat that you are going to expel along that dynamical trajectory in the forward direction. So the more that you're under the same conditions, essentially likely to go forward than you are to see the time reversed movie, then that's related to there being much more heat being lost in the heat bath in the forward direction. And it's a bit complicated because we're talking about microscopic trajectories and we don't relate to the world that way. So, there is a difference between a micro trajectory being time reversed versus like what we perceive when we see a block, sliding back and forth in the table. But there is a bit of intuition that holds here, which is that there are some things in the world that are very time reversible. Like, if I drop a ball and it bounces, like, yes, I lose a little heat from friction, but assuming I didn't, it's very elastic. It's like the ball falls down, bounces up, or the ball, first like gets thrown up and then falls down. That looks very reversible to us. A plant growing from a seed, if I run the movie backwards, and I can tell something is not natural. That doesn't usually happen. Plants, it's obviously there's chemicals. It's not just heat. There's light. So it's a more complicated non-equilibrium process. But it is fair to say that at some level, part of the reason we don't see plants ungrow into seeds is related to this kind of much greater likelihood of the forward moving than the reverse one that has to do with this either heat exchange or more generally what you call entropy production in the ceramics.
So one thing I was thinking about related to this just on my train ride here is basically people talk about this being like the non-equilibrium system is driven, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about it, the equilibrium system is also driven, but it's driven by these infinite entropy like heat. Like it's still being hit, right?
So the way someone wants to use the word driven in a technical sense, it doesn't just mean that there's energy flowed of some kind, or it doesn't just mean that there are external forces. Because you're right, in a heat bath, you have a random force, on the heat bath that's constantly impinging on you.
So it's like a low entropy energy source.
But in the thermodynamic sense, when we say a drive, what we mean is something different. I can't, by just sitting in a heat bath, if I'm a sort of a colloidal particle, maybe that's like a bad, I don't have any eternal reason for either if I'm a colloidal particle. Let's say I'm like a little sort of office toy that can like open and close or something like that. And I'm sitting in heat bath. Yeah, it's true that I'm fluctuating, and sometimes the heat bath will make me open, and sometimes the fluctuations will make me close. So I'm being buffeted by my surroundings in that sense. But we wouldn't call it a drive because, on average, and according to well understood laws of thermodynamics, I can't extract work from that heat flow, right? It's just going to sometimes go in and sometimes go out. And on average, I'm going to obey the Boltzmann distribution. Whereas, on the other hand, if I have an external drive, that external drive can like get me to operate like an engine. It can get me to kind of run around in a circle and turn a wheel, so to speak. And so it is a bit of a technical distinction. But the distinction we make is between like work that can be done by an external drive versus in a heat flow from a heat with the surrounding bath, which can just be due to sort of random fluctuations. And you have to sort of keep track of the whole energy balance in order to see how it fits together. Because it turns out there is actually a generalization of the Boltzmann distribution. So I guess like returning to the historical thing, because of numerical simulations, in late 90s and early 2000s, I think there was a lot more interest suddenly in like, oh, here are some proposed general results related to non-equilibrium stat mech, and we can actually test them in single molecule pulling experiments And also, with lots of numerical simulations that people really got into studying that.
What's a single molecule pulling experiments, like putting it in an AFM and
Yeah, right. Or
slow protein, or do you
these different kinds of setups, either with an optical trap or an AFM, where you could like take a single protein and measure how much work it takes to pull it apart. And so you could really try to experimentally verify some of these results, which people did in the early 2000s. But I think that what that ultimately pointed to is, okay, now it's possible to think about the relationship between thermodynamic quantities and probability again. And I got really interested in that literature kind of by accident initially, just like having conversations with colleagues after I started at MIT, and kind of be like, I realized I don't really understand well enough yet why these results are true. And I went back to it. And then it finally started to seem to me like, oh, okay, I see why this is true now. And I'm starting to see that maybe this points towards telling me something about, how you get lifelike physics, right? And with that, I think is the argument it takes a little more effort to make. So it started with a paper in 2013 that was really just about the cell replication question. It was about deriving.
Before we get into it, I just want to better understand. So the results that you're building on top of is basically this ability to predict the probability of so you have a given path that something falls. So could a path be like, for example, you mentioned like folding and unfolding a protein. So is that if you assume that path is like in some way there's n number of paths between the folded state and the unfolded state. Yeah. So what's the probability of traversing all the paths to the unfolded state versus traversing back to the folded state? Something like this.
Yeah, exactly. And so you end up doing these averages over all the likelihoods of possible ways that something had happened, which is hard to calculate. So it's a less useful calculational tool than the Boltzmann distribution, but you can actually make a generalization of the Boltzmann distribution out of this Crookes relation here. So this is like you get from Crookes in, 99 or something like that. And then if you take this expression and you take a ratio of two versions of the equation and you integrate out some of the internal steps of the trajectories, then you can get, I guess I'll write it out without having the mic for a second. Okay, so if you have your driven scenario, and now you have to ask the question in terms of some period of time over which you're driving a system with some pattern of forcing. And it is going to, over in that period of time, that have work done by the drive. So that's W in this part of the expression here. And there's going to be a probability of landing in some state xi, given that you started in some initial state x0. And you want to compare that to the probability of landing in state xj, given that you started in x0. So it's like two different scenarios where you have the same initial condition, you're being driven the same way, and you get driven in this fluctuating way, and there's a probability distribution over final states. So now you have the ratio of these two probabilities, and you're asking which is more likely. And that is kind of the evolutionary question, though. We don't usually think in biological terms that way, but it's like, which is more likely given some initial condition? So I start, for example, in an initial condition where things are not like life at all. They're just like a mess, and a non-life-like mess. And that's my x0. What's going to be the probability of eventually landing either in state xi or in state xj? And there is still a Boltzmann term here. And so it still matters, like, are you going to go to lower energy or not? Oh, I realized I had an error up here. So this should be EXI. Sorry, that was a typo. So what I care about here is the energy of backside. And now I'm comparing. So this Boltzmann distribution here, there's a Boltzmann term here where you're still interested in, all things being equal, am I rolling downhill in energy? Then is this kinetic term that's basically saying I'm more likely to go to state I than state J if I'm more likely to come back from state I than state J in the same amount of time under a time reverse situation. Because it's kind of like saying, if I'm going somewhere closer in my starting point, or if I'm going to somewhere where I have to cross fewer high mountains on my way to my starting point, that's just going to be easier. And then the last term is the sort of business end of this, which is like, I actually have a J on the top here and an I on the bottom here.
And pi is probability.
Yes. Sorry, I was like also dinosaur probability.
Is a probability of taking this step.
Yes.
Of it.
So in this last set of factors here, what you have is that it's an exponential of the negative of the work that I do on a trajectory from starting from x0 and going to xj, but I'm averaging over all the different ways that can happen. And I have that on the top, and I have on the bottom I here, even though I is on the top over here and is on the bottom over there. So what that's saying is that if I want to make I more probable than j, that all things being equal, I want there to be more work done on the system on typical trajectories that carry me, or not just typical, you could talk in a more complicated way about what that means in this average, but if enough of the trajectories that are possible that carry me from, state 0 to state I absorb a lot of work from the drive, that makes xi more likely than xj. If somehow there's just not as much of a way of getting the system to do positive work on you, or rather getting the drive to do positive work on the system as we're going from state 0 to state j. So this term here is a totally non-equilibrium term, and so is this one, right? This is about work and energy flow. This is about kinetics. And then there's just this one Boltzmann term that Wimmy Daring. So we recover the Boltzmann distribution if we say, okay, there's no drive. So then, basically that makes it so that this thing falls away. And if we say at infinite time, then this thing falls away. And then we're left with the Boltzmann distribution. But at finite times and with external drive, you care about these other factors. And at first, when you look at it, it's not at all obvious what this has to do with biophysics. But I think the thing that started to be intriguing to me, and that led to a whole program of research in my group for a while, is the way to think about this is, go back to the Boltzmann distribution. The Boltzmann distribution helps you to explain a number of different phenomena, right? It helps you to explain, for example, the freezing of ice. That above a certain temperature, you're going to have above a certain temperature, you're going to have liquid water, and below a certain temperature, you're going to have solid ice. And the reason that's happening is because at high temperature, the fact that you have higher entropy in the liquid is going to dominate over the low energy of the ice. And so even though the liquid has higher energy, it will form at a certain temperature because there's just more ways for that to happen, and that dominates the probability. Then when you go to low temperature, the ice freezes and it's solid. And that is controlled by this Boltzmann distribution, because as temperature gets smaller, this beta gets larger, energy matters more, and energy wins out. So number of ways things can happen is always kind of weighing on the scale. Energy is always weighing on the scale. And ice is an example where it points that not always, but under certain circumstances, you can have a certain kind of organization of matter or ordering of matter that is going to result from the fact that there's just kind of a pull towards low energy. But it's, the fact that ice exists and the fact that in general probability goes to low energy because of the Boltzmann distribution and equilibrium, that doesn't mean everything that you see in the world is has an order principle that comes from lowering of energy. But it does mean some of what you're going to find in the world is going to be orderly in a way that can be explained by the lowering of energy, right? Now you go over to this generalization of the Boltzmann distribution here, and you can ask the same kind of question. You can say, all right, so now I'm in a non-equilibrium scenario, and there are these different factors here that weigh on the scale, so to speak, in controlling relative probability of outcome. So might it be the case that there are systems and circumstances where this work term is the thing that's going to dominate? In other words, that maybe not always, it's not always going to be true, but sometimes it will be true that there's an ordering or an organization that happens in a system that will be dominated by this work history term, that it's saying that the most likely thing that's going to happen is going to be really dominated by the history of how the system got into its state and all the work energy that it absorbed from some external drive along the way. And that's a thing to say again, because we so often switch back to talking about the properties of the end state that we get confused. I'm talking about the history, right? So I'm not saying you have to be absorbing lots of work when you're done. I'm saying that if you had a history of having absorbed a lot of work on the way there, that can be the reason that you ended up being a much more likely outcome in the system than lots of other outcomes that didn't have that work absorption history. So they'll eventually unpack why it's important to make the distinction. But I think the analogy, maybe it's in your paper or somewhere else that you gave, is like you have glasses, like wine glasses, and let's say they're all kind of randomly changing size slightly, and then one of them hits the right shape to absorb a lot of sound energy. Let's say you have one frequency of sound, like a woman singing. I don't know, the woman breaks the wine glass, the opera singer breaks the wine glass example. And so if they're all constantly changing, as soon as the wine glass hits the right shape, it breaks, and then it cannot change anymore. It's stuck. Right. And so you're going to end up eventually having most of them broken, because over time they just randomly hit this shape and then they break. Right. So yeah, that's a great example. And it's a subtext example in the sense that when we coined, so you started off asking a question, what's dissipative adaptation? And so dissipative adaptation was the term we originally coined by saying, all right, if we look at this equation, there is going to be a set of scenarios maybe where work history dominates the emergence of order, where you can pay for highly probable orderly states if they have sufficiently high work absorption in their history. And then you add one additional ingredient, which is to say, sometimes it's also true that the shape of the system controls how good it is at absorbing energy, right? That's not universally true. Sometimes, you have a certain drive and it almost doesn't care what shape the system is in. It will dump the same amount of energy in roughly. But if you have a many-body system, like a glass, right? If you're working material, all these atoms in the glass, you can shape the glass different ways. And that example demonstrates the same material in one shape will resonate and absorb a lot of work from a sound field at a certain pitch. Or you could have shaped the glass differently and it won't resonate so much and it won't absorb as much work. And what that points to is that you end up with the possibility of having had a highly work-absorbing history implies something about you visited special states of particular shapes during your history. And that's where it really starts to click, is like, this is an evolutionary principle in some sense, right? And it's not a biological evolutionary principle in most cases, but it has some of those commonalities. So I think at a very high level, the way to think about it is energy is what? It's just motion or the potential for motion, right? And if we think of it in those terms, then we talk about the flow of energy in a many body, many particle, non-equilibrium system where there's lots of different ways of putting the building blocks of the system together. So now I'm going to explore this vast space of all the different ways I could put building blocks together. Like if living things are made of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, phosphorus, some list of atom types. Obviously, I could build a lot of different things out of those atoms, right? We know you can build a pile of fish out of the atoms that I made out, right? So, or you can build things that are alive as well. So there's lots of different ways you can put that many atoms together of different kinds. If you imagine yourself exploring that state space, energy is both going to be the reason you change shape. It's going to supply you with the ability to move. That's what energy is in time. At the time you're moving, it's kinetic energy. And so you can have a system that's like only going to change shape because it's getting supplied energy from an external drive. Otherwise, it's kind of too cold. It's not going to change shape much from thermal fluctuations. And then you change your shape, and that shape will also change what kind of an antenna you are for the flow of energy from the drive. So that's like a feedback loop that kind of closes where you're exploring the space of states, and it's both the case that what energy you're absorbing from the environment will help you to change your shape, and also that when you change your shape, that will alter your ability to absorb energy from the environment in different ways. And when you keep iterating that over and over again, the question is, where does that lead? What kind of a selection of states or of shapes is going to eventually hold after enough time? And the example you talked about with the glasses before then becomes one of the kind of branches or one of the cases of what we then call dissipative adaptation. So if dissipative adaptation is an umbrella as a whole for all the different instances where your state is going to control your access to energy in a very specific way, because that will happen in some systems, and where it ends up being the case that a rare set of orderly states ends up getting selected by the driven dynamics for reasons that have to do with this work absorption history term. That's what dissipative adaptation is. There are going to be then different cases of that. One of them will be this kind of shattering, or what we eventually came to call low rattling behavior. And that's where you have kind of a negative feedback loop like you were describing. I have a lot of different ways the system can move, and if I resonate a lot with the drive, then I make those motions, and making those motions kind of causes me to explore new configurations, and I find new configurations that are not so good at absorbing energy, and then I'm kind of too cold to keep moving, and I get stuck. So that's the glass shattering. The glass moves until it shatters, and then it stops. It doesn't care about the sound anymore. The shards of glass are barely going to move because of the sound field. So that sounds disappointing in terms of, we're looking for lifelike behavior. It actually is a lifelike behavior, and I can return to what that covers. But there's also a positive feedback loop that will sound more familiar, or we think of life as being hungry. Life wants access to energy in the environment. And there can be cases where a system has a state space to explore, and there's a feedback loop that develops where it gets some access to energy from the environment, and then the supply of that energy turns out to tend to cause it to rearrange itself into a state that's even better at absorbing energy. And then it gets more of that energy and it undergoes an even more significant rearrangement. And there's a positive feedback loop up to a point. Obviously, that kind of loop can't usually go on forever. But we had a paper in PRL maybe 10 years ago now, where we were studying just a very simple mechanical system with like balls and springs, but the springs are kind of cash bonds where they're more likely to snap if they are less extended. So if the spring extends, that it kind of is like hooks going together and it can't break, but then it can unhook and break apart when the spring is short. So if you just like shake that system at a certain frequency, it self-organizes to be a resonator at that frequency, because the more it resonates, the more the bonds stretch, and then they can't break, and then they keep resonating and moving. So that's one kind of simple mechanics where you can get a learning behavior where a system is fine-tuning its structure to a particular source of energy in its environment, and it's sort of getting better at eating energy from the environment. But also the low rattling thing can look surprisingly lifelike. It's a different kind of behavior, but it also has a kind of computing aspect to it, because if there's a pattern in the environment and you're getting better and better at not absorbing energy from that pattern, you actually have to anticipate the environment in order to kind of avoid getting knocked to pieces by it. So what you're really learning to do is to be robust to the typical pattern of fluctuations of the environment, which is something living things do. So living beings are kind of both things going on at once in a complex mix. On the one hand, they are part of processes, sometimes it's self-replicating processes where Darwinian selection is your explanation, but not only. There are these positive feedback loops that are getting more access to energy in the environment on the one hand, and on the other hand, they're also kind of learning, and I mean that kind of in an adjacent to machine learning sense over time. They're learning to be better at not being shattered or rearranged by the sources of energy in their environment, and that ends up getting them into particular shapes that are very well matched or fine-tuned to certain sources of energy. So, for example, I can eat a sandwich and I get calories of energy that help sort of push all the chemical water wheels in me and keep me afloat, so to speak. I can't just say one day, like, instead of having a sandwich, I'll have a comparable dose of joules of energy in gamma radiation and I'll be fine, right? That doesn't work. But why doesn't it work? Because most sources of energy are randomizing, right? If it's not the source of energy that I'm fine-tuned and matched to, then it doesn't help me stay in my shape. So both, I say that the low rattling aspects or branch of dissipative adaptation behaviors and these more sort of positive feedback, energy-seeking behaviors, you can look at and you say, this is a situation where I can start with inchoate mess, and then just because of simple physical rules of how the parts interact, if there's a pattern in the environment, then there will be this emergent kind of computing or fine-tuning behavior And it contains an aspect of what life is doing, but it's not the whole story of what life is.
I think it's pretty easy to make like a hand wavy argument that this is true of life. Like, for example, we have the earth with no life, then we have the earth with, simple life, and that's absorbing sunlight more so than, it's able to use like the spectra of sunlight where the atmosphere is transparent and so on. So there's a clear path. And then you have humans. Humans are, burning fossil fuels, building nuclear reactors, right? So there's like this increasing trends of, and it's interesting that it's also like, it's exponentially increasing with humans, right? So that's like a nice argument, but it's not, I would say, is there like a quantitative way to look at what we see here on Earth and say, okay, this is actually, you can quantitatively kind of connect it to these equations, basically. Is that possible, or has anybody worked on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you try to sort of drink the whole ocean and make these theories of what everything does at once, I think usually you run aground on the detailed rules of this sort of the effective theory governing the subsystem really matter here. Like, I always like say that if that famous satellite image of the Korean peninsula at night, where it's like, here's South Korea and it's all bright and North Korea is all dark. Those are both thermodynamically possible, right? So to say that like, oh, it's always more and more energy. Well, people are complicated and history is complicated and there's a lot of different ways things can go. So I think whenever someone tries to articulate an overly simple principle of like the world or the universe is always trying to accelerate the pace of entropy increase or something like that, there's no rigorous way of deriving such a result. And moreover, I think it's stated that simply it's flatly contradicted by observable facts.
But North Korea is like the low rattling version of South Korea, right? So it's like frozen. It doesn't accept energy. It doesn't change.
I have the right. It purely the net property of the end state, but I'm not. I'm not claiming I have a mechanistic explanation in physics terms for why North Korea is the way it is, but I'm saying we're like, well, maybe a better way of putting it is this, or it's a useful opportunity to make a sort of adjacent observation, which is think about now biology and self-replication and Darwinian evolution and natural selection. Those concepts together help us to explain a lot of what is really highly specialized in the behaviors of living things, the form function relationships and properties and all of that. Now, when you look at it through the lens of physics, self-replication, as it turns out, becomes a case of dissipative adaptation. Why? Because, and this was the first paper that I wrote about non-equilibrium static thermodynamics, if you think about just trying to make a generalization of the second law where you think about non-equilibrium dynamics, how statistically irreversible in time an event is turns out to set a minimum cost of entropy production on average for that event. And self-replication is a time irreversible process. It's a process where you're more likely to make 2 from 1 than to make 1 from 2. So to the degree that that's the case, like running the movie backwards doesn't work with self-replication, you have a thermodynamic burn rate, right? You're doing entropy production in the forward direction of the movie. And, we had a paper about this in PRX. I think the title was Statistical Physics of Adaptation. But what that means is that self-replication can be thought of as a case of dissipative adaptation of this positive feedback variety. But you can also have positive feedback processes that are not self-replicator processes that maybe still are learning to eat energy from the environment. But the point is, what that means is that anything we can explain about biology and about the behavior of living things that partly can have an explanation in natural selection, we're not removing or replacing or sweeping aside natural selection by talking about things in the terms of physics, because we're just, once we reach that point in the road, we say, oh, okay, so self-replicators, that's an instance of dissipative adaptation. Whatever you're going to understand now about what you get from Darwinian evolution and natural selection, you think about that on its terms, on the details of your effective theory for that particular system. And it's an interesting observation that it fits into this like larger framework of it is an example of a certain kind of phenomenon from a thermodynamic perspective. So I think that we don't necessarily always predict better or more because we can tell what the thermodynamic background of a set of events is. Sometimes we can predict something we couldn't before. And sometimes it's like, as in this case, I think it draws your attention to a class of phenomena you may not have realized you should be looking for, where you don't have self-replicators, but you can still have a kind of selection principle applying in the evolutionary dynamics of, let's say, robotic swarm. Like this was a paper we had in Science in 2021 where we looked at this low rattling in the swarm robotics side. So I think in general, I'll go back just to summarize. The key thing, again, about the same work history is that there's no point at which physics tells you the universe knows its entropy production rate and it's doing some kind of calculation of trying to figure out how to produce more entropy. People sometimes like to talk that way, but that kind of loose talk, like I don't have a rigorous grounding to put that on. What's true is that if I want to compare, I make the assumptions that usually make that apply pretty well for non-equilibrium statistical thermodynamics, and if I want to apply in a broad range of cases, if I want to compare relative probabilities of outcomes, then work history can be an important weight that weighs on the scale in determining relative likelihood, in the same way that law rate of energy also can be an important weight that weighs on the scale, like with the formation of ice. And exactly how that plays out in a particular system, you have to look at that system. When you look at the Earth, there's the sun, and there's, reactions going on in the Earth's core. Try to actually make a model of all of that where you're sure that your predictions are right. It's hard.
Just thinking as you're talking, are there some subsystems that are interesting on a practical level that where you can search for? Like two examples I can think of are, let's say you have your microbiome, right, in the gut of an animal like a human or something else, and there's some population of bacteria in there, right? And there, some of them have one type of metabolism versus another and so on, and you have the driving forces like whatever food you're eating plus maybe some other factors, right? So like, can you look at the population, let's say you sequence the population of bacteria and basically see whether there's a, it roughly aligns, like is there any kind of alignment between that, like the way these different bacteria metabolize and the populations you're seeing versus the inputs, let's say the chemical inputs?
So I think that there's some very interesting literature on, let's say, the boundary between microbiome metabolism or ecology, mathematical ecology, and trying to think thermodynamically or physicochemically. Some of the people I think who do the most interesting work on this are Arvin Morgan, Guy Bunin, Mikhail Tikhonov. There's some others. I would say with all of those kinds of systems, from what I can understand from it, you should think of it as being too complicated to be able to somehow better predict what happens because you have the sort of towering height of perspective of thermodynamics, because each one of the sort of atoms of that world is like a whole bacterium, right? And it operates according to whatever rules it operates according to that are cruising already at a very high altitude above the hard thermodynamic constraints. So like the second law can give you, inequalities that you have to obey, but life is, generally speaking, not close enough to those inequalities that you see a lot of effects from those hard constraints, because it's very hard to operate that efficiently, and maybe not so wise in a sense for a variety of reasons. But I think what's true is the way I would put it differently actually is that the low rattling aspect actually turns out to be a more general statement about dynamical systems that to some degree steps free of thermodynamics. Like that we realized first this was an opportunity because we were looking for systems that kind of were examples of dissipative adaptation as we defined it, because we first thought of this by thinking of it in thermodynamic terms. But once you start thinking about how Loralic works, it's like, I have lots of degrees of freedom, and I have a system where it's exploring different states that it could be in. And in some of those states, the dynamics are going to be much more randomized in terms of how they explore. And in other of those states, it's either going to explore less or it's going to explore more localized or more organized, those subregions of configuration space. And so if I have any dynamical system where there is some sense of these are the changes in the system that will reduce diffusivity and randomness of exploration, or increase dynamical order, or increase or like reduce access to a sort of external forcing that causes things to change shape, there's a lot of self-organization that you could explain in systems where you don't think about energy at all, but you just think about basically where probability is likely to accumulate and how that's related to the reduction of noisiness and the emergence of organized coordinated motions. So I think that in that sense, that may actually have something to say for mathematical ecology. And if you want, you could then look at, some of the energetics of that. But I think that a single living cell uses energy for so many different purposes that talking about what we were just saying with, self-replication of thermodynamics, well, if I'm feeding these bugs more, they aren't necessarily going to grow faster, right? They could use that food to sense things more, carefully, and just try to give a full account of everything they could be burning their fuel to do. Computation costs fuel, copying yourself costs fuel, various things, definitely costs. So from a physics perspective, I find it easier to break it down into separate cases. Like, we have different papers over time where it was like, let's look at the thermodynamic cost of maintenance and repair, or let's look at the thermodynamic costs of self-replication, etc.
What if we go one level down? So another example that I think maybe is even mentioned in your paper, just like 2 words or something, but like I don't know exactly if I'm naming this correctly, but like the amyloid proteins that accumulate in the brain. Like, for example, can we calculate whether that follows these thermodynamic principles? And if it doesn't, then that maybe has, or very, poorly follows them, maybe that implies that there's a certain kind of mechanism versus a different kind. Like if there's a kind of thermodynamic mechanism that means one thing, maybe if it doesn't really show a thermodynamic mechanism, then it might suggest some other, like a different, more like, how would you put it? Like more evolutionary mechanism or something like that, more like genetic, kind of something that's more in the biology.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned protein folate in the cell, because the way I would put it is I do think proteins in the cytosol or in the living cell in general are an interesting arena for some of these ideas, but it's not so much that I think it would be very easy to calculate whether a given piece of a living cell is obeying this kind of a fundamental equation or not. One of the things we didn't dwell on, but which is definitely true, is that these averages of exponentials, when you average the exponential of something, exponentiation makes it really big if, you're at the high end of its magnitude. And so it's a very lopsided weighting of things that you're averaging. So as a result, you need really, really good sampling of the distribution before you can converge the values of these exponential averages. That was a big thing that people grappled with after the Yarzinski result, which was 97, I think. And the point is that that's not going to be a useful calculational tool, except when you're talking about like a single protein. Even a cell is just like too big and too hot, and you're not going to get sampling that will, at least as people understand it currently, really able to kind of close these calculations.
And just from a computational, it's just too expensive to compute.
It's not, it's even worse than that. It's like you don't even know what to compute. You don't know most of the quantities that you'd have to include in that. You can't measure it precisely enough. There are also kinetic parameters here you're not going to be able to measure that matter of this equation. So if this is a less useful, although it is the generalization of the Boltzmann distribution for non-equilibrium, it's a much less useful calculation tool than the Boltzmann distribution. The Boltzmann distribution is a special case where things simplify. Through specialization of the Lord-Allen mechanism, we've argued there also is a simple case that is maybe a more useful calculational tool. And that was in the paper I mentioned about swarm robotics in 2021. But I do think frontier folding in a cell is an interesting thing to bring up in this context nonetheless, because you mentioned amyloid. Amyloid is one example of a wider variety of ways in which proteins jump between conformational kinetic traps. Right? They're these big floppy molecules. They stick together. They aggregate in different ways. They have lots of different ways they can be configured, and they don't explore all of them just from thermal fluctuations. They're mostly kind of trapped in a subspace of configurations, and then they can get lifted out of those by external drives like motor proteins and like chaperones that are burning ATP in order to apply work and sort of rearrange the shapes of other proteins. So what's interesting about that is that means a single cell, which has in it, let's say, hundreds of millions or maybe billions of proteins or something, you have lots of proteins in a cell. Each one of those proteins is a many-body system with a bunch of different kinetic traps that it can get jumped between by external forcing, but which it's not going to jump between very much because of thermal fluctuations. And now you ask, well, what's the collective behavior I expect in such a system if I have time-varying external drives or, non-equilibrium drives that that deliver energy into the system differently depending on its configuration? There's a lot that could be computed by a single cell about variations in its environment and all the inputs to the cell, et cetera, that will be computed by the herd behavior of all the proteins in the cytosol as they aggregate, and some form of amyloid and some bits of amyloid bind to chaperones, and the chaperones, deliver energy and change their shape. And, so there is a very interesting question of how much computation of a potentially useful sort about the statistics of the environment is being performed at steady state for free just by what the cell is made of, and then how could you actually harness or harvest the results of such a computation? And that could maybe gets us back to also, like, what does all this really have to do with the origins of life? Because I have been describing things that are sort of lifelike behaviors maybe that you can think about in physical terms, because my approach to thinking about the origins of life is trying to kind of divide and conquer and say, what are different things life does? How do we take them apart and make a kind of physical examination of each one of these phenomena? Predictive computation, or structural robustness to fluctuating environments, or energy harvesting, self-replication, different things like that. And when you go back to imagining an actual prebiotic scenario, the question is, like, how does all of this fit together? And I won't say like, oh, yeah, I know exactly how the first membrane-enclosed cell with double-stranded DNA came into being or something like that. That's a very contingent particular story. And obviously, we don't have a lot of forensic evidence of that for very good reason. But I think sometimes when people talk about the origins of life, they imagine that before you have self-replicating things that can experience the Darwinian mechanism of selection, that everything is just a complete mess with no form and function and no computation and nothing that's lifelike in it. And that's why it's so hard to explain, because it's like, where did that first smart thing come from so it could go around making more smart copies of itself? But things get much grayer if you say, oh, well, really any many-body system with diverse response properties and combinations of its constituent parts can have an emergent tendency to compute non-trivial things about the statistics of its complex environment just from these kind of low rattling or other kind of feedback mechanisms that you get in a dissipative adaptation framework. And so I think that what's interesting in real biology then to ask is, are there things living things now exploit or now do where they sort of put software on top of something that was computing stuff for free, right? That like cytosol before Darwinian selection would already be computing some useful things for you, even if it were totally inchoate and dumb. And then you can learn how to harvest the results of those computations and exploit them for a selective fitness that's happening at the level of the cell replicator by fine-tuning and optimizing, all the different binding sites and all the different proteins and making what they're doing be more specialized. So that is the interesting thing, is to say both how much can we show lifelike computation is happening in place sites, but in ways we haven't been looking for it in a variety of driven many-body systems that are subject to patterns on the one hand. And on the other hand, if we look at living things, we have a tendency to explain everything that they're doing that's smart as being some downstream consequence of Darwinian selection at the level of the cell replicator. But can we identify things that living things do that really are sort of making use of or harvesting the emergent computation properties of the fact that they are this fluctuating, diverse mess of components that is experiencing non-equilibrium drives?
So when you use the word computation, let me try to unpack that. So basically you're talking about, there's some information about the environments that could be written down, for example, like the wavelength of light that you're receiving, or the shape, there's day and night, there's whatever it is, right? The shape of the environment in some like n-dimensional space.
Yeah.
When you talk about computation, I guess you're really talking about the system rearranges itself in a way where there's an imprint of and a memory kind of, or like some kind of boiling down of the external environment in the system itself.
Yeah. So you mentioned amyloid before, you also mentioned memory. So the interesting thing is that if you come from the biological side, there are known examples where it turns out amyloid proteins in living cells end up being used by the cell as kind of memory storage, in yeast at least. There's one, case that was studied. And when biologists find things like that, it's like, oh, that's cool. Here's like one funny little thing that this one organism does, and maybe nothing else does it. And it's just interesting to study, on its own barrel. But when I look at that example, I think the protein is called SUP35, but there may be other things that are like it that have been studied at this point. I look at that example and think, like, why can't all proteins, do that to some extent?
So what does it mean that it stores information?
So yeah. Now, to make that aspect more precise, I like your description of kind of like the multidimensional shape of the environment, such as the frequency of something. So maybe the clearest study or of a couple that we did in simulation with this was with a random spin glass, an Ising spin glass. So there you have just a bunch of bits or arrows that point up and down, and you have a Sybil energy function for how they couple to each other, which, you make it random coupling so that some of them want to kind of point parallel, some of them want to point anti-parallel when it's all frustrated. So you have this rugged energy landscape with lots of different comparable local minima. And people have studied those systems for a long time. They've been interested in their equilibrium properties and in their relaxation properties if they start away from equilibrium because they're glassy. But what we did, it was a little different, was we said, let's do a time-varying external drive where the external drive has a barcoding to it. So you have 250 bits or spins or arrows. And with arrow 1, you push it up. And with arrow 2, you push it down. And it's a force, so it's not going to push up or down immediately, but it's like you're applying a force that makes it tend to want to point down, or you're applying a force that makes it tend to want to point up. And you apply up, down, up, down, up.
Just how they're continuously flipping also just from thermal.
Yeah, exactly. So over time with thermal fluctuations, they'll make random motions, and the relative likelihood of those motions will be affected by the forces. Yeah. So it's a totally physical, thermodynamically sensible system where random flips of bits up and down over time happen under conditions where first you have one barcode where arrow 1, there's a tendency, a bias you're applying to make it flip up. Then for arrow 2, it's down. For arrow 3, it's down, etc. Then you change the barcode after a finite amount of time. So the system can't reach equilibrium anyway. It's glassy, but you wait some time, you change the barcode. Then you change the barcode again. Then you change the barcode again. And if there's like 250 bits, then there's like 2 to the power 250 barcodes that you could have. That's a lot of them. So you could just always keep cycling random barcodes out of that old deck, and that's a very big deck. That would be driving effectively with a random field. And that's unlikely to produce any result other than effectively raising the temperature of the spin glass a little bit, because essentially you're just kind of evolving heat through friction that is, gradually percolating through the system and then being lost into the path. But what if you just pick 10 barcodes and you just keep on with replacement, kind of shuffling them randomly and picking one and then picking another and picking another? On the one hand, if you showed me those barcodes, they look kind of random to me. On the other hand, I'm only using 10 of them, and 10 is a very small number out of 2 to the power 250 or something. So really, this very low dimensional or highly correlated subset of barcodes, that's just kind of, I'd have to discover empirically how to encode the relationships of picking those 10 barcodes. But I actually have an environment that has the very special statistics that is not random. And so now I just keep driving the system for a while with those 10 barcodes, flipping them randomly. And what happens is, on average, initially the work absorption is high, and eventually the work absorption goes down, and it settles into a steady state that's at a lower value. And that's the low Rayleigh effect, because initially my system was in a random state, but after a long time, it's in a state that is bad at absorbing energy from these barcodes. So it cooled down and it can't move as much. The fluctuations don't jump it around as much because it's in a state that's kind of moving in step to not get rearranged. And that's how it got stuck. Now I switched to a different deck. I switched to a different set of 10 barcodes. And now the energy work absorption spikes. And then over time it relaxes again and it finds a new, lower value because it's learned the new pattern of the environment. So this is a totally primitive, simple physics system, but where it's exhibiting kind of novelty detection behavior that is almost like machine learning, except
it sounds like the brain, right? It's like connections in the brain, changing strength and all these things.
But what's interesting is that whereas we imagine it's the case in the brain, it must be, and certainly in the case of machine learning, there's kind of mechanisms to have an algorithm that's trying to optimize something, right? So that's trying to reweight things or whatever it is in order to hit a target response property that you're trying to learn from the data. But here the learning behavior is just coming from physical dynamics. Like it is effectively acting like a model that's being trained to lower the, to have a lower energy absorption from some environmental pattern, and therefore to have, in a sense, computed or learned something about the pattern of that environment, such that when you change the pattern of the environment, you can get a signal that tells you, all right, new environment, I detect that you've changed the statistics that you're driving you with.
Is it a smooth, like in the case of the neural network, you can show it a picture of a cat or like a picture of a cat with a pixel missing or something, right? It'll still give you 99% cat. Does it have that same behavior where if you change the barcode slightly, you still get, it's like stable until you change it sufficiently?
That's interesting. We haven't done the experiment of kind of mutating the barcode. Yeah, it's like we did like the sort of change it to a completely different set. But I think that's an interesting question. And I think it's also going to depend on like how many bits there are, like, what's the capacity of a certain number of bits. And so I think there's many ways to kind of expand out and study more in that area. But I present it as an example of just this is a system that acts like it's doing something you might have thought to do with machine learning, but it's only doing that because the physical dynamics requires, in a sense, from very simple rules and very basic thermodynamic considerations, that it's trying to optimize an input-output relationship, and then therefore has to compute something. I think that should also be true of cytosol. It should be true of a lot of different hot messes out there in the world that we think are just cytosol. What's that? Sorry, like the mixture of proteins in the interior of living cells. Any many-body system with diverse components that have kinetic traps that they kind of only can jump between when they get an external energy supply, and the access to that external energy supply probably depends on their shape. At that point, you're going to have your mess start computing things about the statistics of the environment over time. And that doesn't automatically get you to membrated closed cell with a double-stranded DNA, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it does lift our sights to the possibility that there's a much greater spectrum between complete inchoate non-life and things that we think of as being, the bare minimum. Even with respect to DNA, like we think of DNA as the message that has to be copied, right? But that's because that's how we discovered it, and that's how we now relate to it. But if I didn't know cells divided and I was just shown a movie of one cell and I was asking what is the DNA for, I wouldn't say it's for being copied. I would say it's a kind of control center. It is a tiny number of degrees of freedom inside the cell whose state has enormous impact on the rest of what all the other degrees of freedom in the cell are doing. And where, in a sense, if I now look at the cell in relation to its environment, it's as though the DNA encodes information that's been learned about, what the environment is likely to be doing, right? If you need to do oxidative metabolism, you need genes that can do oxidative metabolism for you. And so, in a sense, if you have genes for oxidative metabolism, it's like the prediction that there might be some oxygen in your environment at some point. But the point is that it may not be DNA that exactly does this in prebiotic mess that is somewhat self-organized, but the idea of a small subset of degrees of freedom that start to be kind of like a central organizing hub for the dynamics of the rest of the system, and that maybe become a place that accumulates memory, that accumulates information that helps the system to kind of adapt to the environmental fluctuations. That's something where I think looking for self-organization principles that predate self-replication, we have indications that really, could be a very fruitful avenue.
Yeah, I think there's this recently published paper. I mentioned this to you before we started the podcast, but it's about basically they're in the RNA world, which is kind of this. I would say it's interesting because in Origins of Life, there are all these different communities that they're not really talking that much because they're coming at the problem from such different places, and they kind of don't. There's not a lot of overlap. There's this problem in the RNA world that I think is, from what I understand, is unsolved, which is that to make an RNA that can catalyze something, you need a relatively long RNA, like 100 bases, something like that. But the accuracy of copying increases with 1/n. So your error rate has to drop at 1/n. So to have a 100 base pair RNA that copies itself, it also needs to be very accurate compared to like a 3 base pair RNA or something. But how do you achieve that accuracy without having some evolutionary mechanism or something? And so that's like some fundamental unsolved problem that I don't think anybody's had like a great answer to, as far as I know, until this paper, which is really interesting, which is that if you have a bunch of small RNAs, like a couple of base pairs, 5 base pairs or less, they'll condense into kind of like an oil droplet inside the cell, which itself can then catalyze reactions on its surface. So individual RNAs, small ones, cannot really, but that condensate can do it, and it has some memory and some, special behaviors.
I think that follows the right intuition, and it's related to what we were just saying about cytosol. Like, I think flash mobs of diverse components and whose exact composition can be subtly impacted by things that are changing in the environment, and the possibility of, emergent fine-tuning of exactly how those components interact and how they condense over time. The more you create a situation where you get to kind of have a much larger collection of possible participants in a group, and then you get to, in a sense, interview all the N choose K possibilities that could participate in that group by just having them all together in a bowl, so to speak. And then those condensates that happen to work really well can work really well by condensing. There's a bit of, when you let diverse groups of components vote with their feet, you have more of a chance to get something interesting off the ground. And I think this also relates to maybe more sort of ecological pictures of self-replication that people have suggested, where it's like, if you're trying to look for one self-replicator that can get itself going, it always seems really hard. But if you're looking for a community of different weakly catalyzing and sort of weakly interacting components to be better at pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, to me, the intuition always is from mathematics is, if I have a matrix that's roughly, very primitively represents kind of a linear dynamics for a bunch of components, and I just have it have promiscuous random weak feedback, some of the modes of that, so the eigenvectors or whatever, will have positive feedback generally, right? So there will be collective behaviors that experience positive feedback, even if you're just randomly connecting the individual components. And so if you can make your first cell replicator out of some kind of stampede with a subset of components, then maybe getting positive feedback is kind of a thing that's more guaranteed once you have large N and diversity.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. What do you think is like in terms of, you know, a lot of people are working on the chemistry and kind of the closer to biology theory of origins of life. What do you think, is there a next step to the thermodynamic approach? Like, is there like a kind of like possible, you know, is there a foothold on the rock face above this, like the result from 2015, like the Nature paper in 20?
Yeah. So what there are a few problem spaces that I have been curious about for a while and would like to maybe make more headway in. I would say that, first of all, it needs to be said that in what we've already discussed, for dissipative adaptation itself, probably the most important thing now is just to keep accumulating experimental examples where we can do a better and better job showing that something like this is happening. And particularly because I think is it potentially applicable to a broad diversity of different kinds of systems, you know, like metamaterials and colloidal particle assemblies and chemical reaction networks. And like you could keep listing things where maybe something like this, you know, you could go look and see if something interesting is happening. And so just looking for experimental collaborators who have a kind of a system where something seems like there's an exciting opportunity.
I mean, a not obvious one that seems to be coming out of this is like just thinking systems, right? Rather than finding a system that can like replicate itself or whatever, but just a system that can compute using these principles.
Right. Yeah. So I mainly would classify that as a separate avenue, but also what I'm interested in, which is like, could you do something like machine learning at a much lower thermodynamic cost because you're harnessing the emergent computation of an unprogrammed mess rather than doing very precise calculations of the sort you do on a classical computer, where each bit has to be very carefully controlled, right? So that I think is interesting, especially now that the energy costs of compute for ML are becoming a really big part of the discussion. You know, could you do things that get you kind of the same amount of compute, but, you know, at much lower wattage? There's an interesting implication there. But I think I view that as somewhat is an application, but it's maybe not the same thing as like sort of proof of concept for.
Do you have a design for a chip in mind? Like, have you thought about how you would wire a bunch of components on the chip?
I should have a detailed design. I'm very interested to talk to, you know, someone who would have better ideas about how to make that concrete. I'm not a.
But I feel like in total sciences, it's almost. I think it's conceivable that you could wire a bunch of existing or close to existing components that are already used in chips, right?
Yeah, no,
again, some kind of behavior like this, that's definitely conceivable.
Even sort of the materials that gave us the theoretical field of spin glasses maybe is an interesting place to start. I mean, what you want is just for there to be a lot of glassiness and metastability that you can manipulate with external fields, and where you have the ability to read out what you want to from the sort of control points where you're going to be collecting the answer that the, you know, uncontrolled mess is giving you, because you have to have some layer where you're going to train on top of that or read out what you expect to find there. But getting back to other avenues for that.
Wait, I have a crazy question that just came up to my. But this, I don't know if there's an answer, like good answer to this question. But would a quantum computer follow the same thermodynamics? Like, what happens if you have quantum bits? Like some, you know, what atoms and their quantum states are entangled, and does it follow?
So usually, what we would say is that you don't want your quantum computer in contact with a heat bath, and so the physics we use to argue for this kind of behavior might preclude, you know, being able to create a qubit in that kind of a setting, because you want coherence, you don't want, you know, that's the bring about decoherence. Although the mention of quantum computing, I would say, is relevant in that I would say both this thing that we're now talking about, could you, harness some kind of behavior, in the space of dissipative adaptation in order to do a better kind of a better version of a certain kind of computation for cheaper in some sense, cheaper in energy or cheaper in number of controlled computing degrees of freedom. I think it's interesting to compare to GPUs and quantum computers and say, we're starting to get the sense that the way this works is that different physical architectures for computing have different specialized applications that they might be very good at. Like, I think quantum computing gets a lot of buzz because everyone's just very excited about, like, not being even sure what the limits are of what it could do. But the truth is that our original motivation for it was kind of like the Shor algorithm and things that show us particular kinds of problems you can do way better in the scaling if you do it on a quantum computer. And it's not as clear, I think, that quantum computers will eventually be better at everything. And GPUs are better than, desktop computers at a lot of, let's say, large numbers of matrix operations. And that's turned out to be really important for ML. So I think it's kind of it's starting to be like, maybe we'll have this zoo of different embodiments of computation where they have their advantages and disadvantages, but where for certain kinds of calculations, maybe, this is the way you go. If you want it to be like very good scaling for factoring prime numbers, then use your quantum computer. If you want it to be very low energy costs for doing slightly noisy ML trainings, then maybe you use some kind of Thermodynamic computing thing. And maybe, thinking about dissipative adaptation helps in the design of that. But I think that if you now go over to the question of new horizons in thermodynamics and what comes out of this, I think maybe the thing that is most interesting to me is to think about the connection to aging, in the sense that there are just like a lot of things that tickle my nose, and it's hard to make it fully rigorous, but I think about it sometimes, and I want to maybe start working on this with a student soon. Is like, if you have the following idea: on the one hand, that self-repair costs energy, which we had some papers about that, and you can kind of argue it in general terms. Everything like kinetic proofreading or whatever, you need some kind of fuel in order to power your increased fidelity. So fidelity in self-maintenance of a complex system maybe has an energy cost on the one hand. Then on the other hand, what's also true is that metabolism at some level is damaging. Like that pumping energy through the system is going to disrupt the system. It's going to increase its ability to kind of skate through configuration space and explore random configurations that are damaged configurations. And so it seems like there might be some fundamental trade-off there where it's like, if I want to eat in order to stay alive, I'm also kind of damaging myself with the energy flow that eating involves. And then I have to repair myself partly because of that. And can you beat the house and just always do a better job at self-repair? Or are there some things that it's going to be kind of hard to get around? So I'm interested in that question of like, are there fundamental thermodynamic constraints on if I'm using my energy supply to repair myself and at the same time I'm also causing damage to myself by eating, then do I run into some contradiction there or some horizon that I can't cross? And it is interesting that, we have empirically in biology these links between low metabolism and longevity that have been characterized. So that could be a coincidence, or it could be something that is kind of, one can understand better. And so that's one kind of thing. And then also just like trying to make it more practical and workable. There's a paper we're going to submit soon that is about kind of how dissipation from drag. The reason is, if you connect with self-organization, may have relationships to how the same reason, in a sense, that being at a low temperature in an equilibrium system helps you to get organized at equilibrium may also help with certain kinds of dynamical organization for driven systems. And that's something that has to be understood through the lens of study dynamical systems and this chaos. That's something I've been working on under the
What's like a simple example?
former postdoc, Paulo Chubikov. Sorry,
What's a simple example of that? Like a toy example?
Well, there's a famous simple example of mixed chaos, which is called the kicked rotor, where it's like a pendulum that's on a platform in outer space that has a rocket that fires like in a delta pulse at constant period in time. So it usually has no gravity, and it has these delta pulses of gravity for a short time. And that is a system that has interesting mixed chaotic behavior where if you start in certain initial conditions in the phase plane, then you get chaos. And if you start in other initial conditions, then you get these regular orbits. And so coupling that to a heat path with drag, ends up being interesting, and looking at noise. So yeah, that's, practically speaking, some interesting recent work we've been trying to push on. But I think that the aging thing is, makes me curious, definitely. And also more generally, just kind of the understanding better the thermodynamic costs of a transformation with fidelity, meaning that you're changing the state of a system, but you're trying to kind of hold it within certain boundaries in the configuration space. And a lot of what biology is doing seems to be kind of trying to do that. It's trying to repair itself, maintain itself, but also undergo dynamics and change, and be able to pay the bills for that thermodynamically. And then the last thing also is just like thermodynamics is how you kind of break the relationship between correlation and causation, right? Like in an equilibrium system, correlation and susceptibility of one variable to another are kind of identical concepts. Like I look at the 2-point correlation function of two variables, and it tells me about if I push on one of them, how much is the other one going to move on average. But if I become a non-equilibrium system, I break that relationship, so you can have very directional causation that doesn't run as much in the other direction. And biology really has to exploit that in order to operate. And once you think in those terms, a lot of what living things do works that way. So I think that's also kind of an interesting avenue to explore.
Okay, I have a couple of completely changing gears. So I have a couple of questions about maybe science and religion. So I think it's interesting to ask you this because obviously you have a lot of background in religion as well, which we haven't covered. But so, probably one of the fundamental problems that, science doesn't really address is no matter what our explanation is of the starting point, like where did everything come from? If you have a rational explanation from that, you can always ask, where did that come from? And so there's this irrational kernel in the center. That reappears every time you pull away a layer, like you peel away a layer of the onion. Do you think that there's hope for eliminating that irrational kernel? And how do you deal with that intellectually?
That's a very well put question. I think that, first of all, as an aside, sometimes there are theoretical physicists who a little bit kind of want to sweep that question under the rug because it's fun to play the game of pretending we can ignore it. Like they try to write down theories of how a universe gets its fundamental parameters, and it pretends to be playing the game of, oh, now we have a theory of where universes come from, so we can explain why our universe might be this way or that way. And of course, you're right. Any attempt at trying to like posit a probability distribution for universes being this way or that way, you can always ask, well, why does the distribution have that form, and what determined that to be the case, and why couldn't it have been a different form? And so it's this infinite regress. And so, yeah, the activity of science does not, by definition, address itself to that question. And that's okay. We can still do science and we can learn a lot, but we shouldn't hold up hope that if we just are smarter and we just are more successful at science that will eventually remove that kind of existential longing that we might feel to understand something like that. So in terms of my own approach to this kind of a question, it's going to be very rooted in Judaism. I didn't have this majorly as part of my upbringing, but after I started grad school, I got much more interested in being a Jew. I'm living in Israel now, and have been for years. At some point, probably just for practical use in the home and stuff, I got ordination as an Orthodox rabbi, which is basically just kind of like doing.
What's the practical purpose of being a rabbi?
Well, so it's like doing a night school law degree in Jewish law, because you're trying to follow Jewish law and you just want to understand how it works better so that you can make decisions. And like if you care about it, then it's like, how do you keep your kitchen kosher? Well,
Okay, I actually had a question for you on this topic before you answer the serious question.
Sure.
So I was at a friend's house who's a religious Jew, and my wife put something that like a meat object into a bowl that was a milk bowl, and they gifted it to us. They said, we can't keep this anymore, like it's permanently damaged by the meat. And the reason was that it was a ceramic bowl, okay? However, in the past, ceramics used to have no glaze, like probably 3,000 years ago. People weren't glazing their ceramics. It's a very high temperature process. But now ceramics are glazed, and I would argue that the ceramic bowl is actually, the outside is made of glass. Because is it now possible to wash? Because glass you can wash, right? But what's your opinion on that?
overflow, can I ask you, was the bowl hot at the time?
No, but the meat, it was like meat broth, so probably that was there was yes.
There's hot stuff. It's some part of the equation. Okay, so then maybe there was reason to be concerned.
My understanding was that there's like a porosity argument, but it still goes into the pores of the ceramic.
In that particular example, I think you make a great point. I think that in halakha, like in Jewish law, sometimes the answer is going to be hard to understand in terms like the argument you're making, only in the sense that we sometimes create categories that are based on classifications made by the sages a long time ago, where we don't necessarily want to complicate them because it won't cover all cases, even if we have a situation where like it really is, under the given circumstances, like more okay than like that. You're absolutely right that a clay bowl 3,000 years ago was highly porous and really absorbed whatever you had in it. And so the idea that you can't remake kosher a sort of a clay vessel is much more reasonable talking about old clay vessels than it is talking about ones that have maybe a glaze on it that is kind of the equivalent of glass, on the one hand. On the other hand, the bowl is not a glass bowl because it, and it might have chips in it. And so if you're going to try to convince someone to say to everyone, like, the new rule that everyone will follow is that today, don't worry about this clay bowl thing. Well, there are cases where it still kind of could matter. And so
I think the chips, that's a very good,
right. So someone, I think that's a great, almost the same example that you could raise, where I think there really is a serious discussion, and some people are trying to, raise it in the present day, which is stainless steel, because metal objects, are also ones that back in the day were much more porous. And it is possible to re-kosher a metal object by boiling it, for example, or by, dipping it in flame. But the question is, should you even have to do that? Because stainless steel surfaces don't absorb anything, right? They absorb molecular, like minuscule quantities of what's on them if you really scour them. And that was different when you had like a porous iron, like a cast iron skeleton, you might consider to be in a different category than a stainless steel pot. So in practice, there are, reasonable discussions to be had. It also is a matter of technicality in Jewish law. It's like, if you can convene what's called a Sanhedrin, which is a Greek word for, a collection of Torah sages that can make rulings on the new rules or whatever, there are some things that you could sort of edit, but until that happens, then people say, no, we should follow the tradition. So it's a deep subject if you want it to be.
It's very similar to Bitcoin. It's very hard to make a change in the Bitcoin code base. And there's very similar discussions about really small.
So imagine that once the Bitcoin code base has been around for thousands of years, how much harder it will be. But yeah, so I think that you make a point. But I think it's it's a more reasonable, I think someone under slightly different circumstances might have still made an issue out of something that you could have made an even better argument wasn't an issue, depending on what material we're talking about. But, it's a fair point. Okay, so getting back to, so the profound question, I think that in the Torah and in Judaism, with regard to that question in particular, the sort of why is there something instead of nothing, the sages and the Torah itself don't actually propose to give an answer to that question. They propose to give a methodology you can choose to attach yourself to for living in the world in light of that question. So that sounds maybe to people like I'm not being accurate because you read the beginning of the book of Genesis and it's like, oh, in the beginning God made the heaven and the earth, and so that sounds like you're proposing an answer that it all comes from God and He decided, and then you can say, but how do you know? And saying, well, how do you know that God made the world sounds like the same as the question of, well, how do you know where the laws of physics came from? And it's the same infinite regress. And so people who are kind of reading themselves the Western Enlightenment, they feel like, got you. You haven't solved the problem at all by writing the book of Genesis. But I think that that's a methodological mistake in what the Torah or the 5 books of Moses, which begin with the book of Genesis, really is meant to be used for. Like it's a misunderstanding of the proper use of the text. Because, first of all, there's a lot of subtext in the book of Genesis that basically, if you studied it carefully, you'd be saying like, well, wait, but it says in the beginning God created, the heavens and the earth, but it kind of also sounds like there was stuff before that, implicitly, given other things that are being described, like, there was water, right? Like, where did the water come from? What does it mean that He created the heavens and the earth, but there was already water? So where did the water come from? So it's not even proposing to actually solve these questions in any sense. It doesn't say in the beginning there was nothing. It doesn't begin with some very Greek, radically abstract notion of there was void and like definitional emptiness. And the sages play all these games with this, but like, here are all the things that there was before the world was created, or whenever, the Torah was before the world was created. So, because they always like to kind of make fun of overly simple philosophy.
I mean, look, the secular version of this is like, did math exist before the universe, right? That's like,
sure. Yeah. And, that we could open that discussion up in a second. But I think that even more than that, methodologically, it's like, when it says, in the beginning, God created heavens and the earth, who is God? What does this word mean when the text uses it? And it's not meant to be obvious or easy to understand. And in fact, it's meant to be a process of study where you learn the meaning of that word from its use in context, from the rest of the Torah, and from, a process of that is supposed to involve, among other things, like studying the law and trying to live in the world according to the law. And the reason I think that makes it different actually becomes easier to express in some ways, I find, in this era where people are familiar with physics and machine learning and they understand what it is to make a model. Because I mean that in the following sense. You can take the same data and you can come up with various predicted models for what you have explaining these different data points and how they're connected to each other, right? So I can, make a plot, and I can say, oh, it kind of looks like a parabola. I'm going to fit the points. It's a parabola. And the model that I have is, this is the trajectory of a cannonball. And I have Newton's laws, and they tell me, a cannonball moving in gravity. Or I could have a different model that fits those points where I'm going to, use a Gaussian process regression to fit some spline through the points. And it's not exactly a parabola, but maybe it still generalizes when I, start looking at more points, and it still kind of fits them, right? So you have different choices in how you fit data. And it's your choice what kind of model to use to fit the data, and you have to make the judgment of how well you're doing, right? You have your metrics for success. So I think that what the Torah is trying to actually do in a sense, introducing you to the concept of God is saying, but by saying God created the whole world and everything that is, what it really is saying is everything that is and everything that you observe, that's your data set, right? And it's proposing to you that actually the best model of that data set for certain purposes, meaning the purposes that the Torah is concerned with, which is like how you should live and act in the world, right? The best model of that data set actually is that there's a personality who has desire for you to act a certain way, and has the desire to express his will through history and through the events of your life and everything like that. And so in a sense, you could say like that's a choice to make about how you relate to the data of the world. And it's not even mutually exclusive with other ways of modeling the world. Like sometimes you want to make a model where you say, I want that cannonball to hit that target over there. And then I need a model that's fit to that purpose. And, I use Newton's laws, I take account for the wind or whatever, and maybe I could hit my target. And so that's a good model for that purpose. And I don't necessarily need another model in order to do that thing. But what the Torah is trying to do is to say, instead of asking the question, why are things this way, is making a proposal. It's saying, why don't you try assuming things are this way? Because everything that is the expression of a personality. Why should you do that? Because actually one of the things that your brain is best at is making inferences about what a personality wants you to do once you have some experience of trying to have dialogue with it, right? Like you actually experience the entire world as data, right? Like you see things, you feel things, and you're very already comfortable with the idea that like, oh, there are other people, and I'm having a conversation with another person right now. And really that's kind of a predictive model, a frame that you're putting on the sense data of the world. And it just works well enough that you come to trust it. And you say like, oh, I can get around in the world by using words and using signs that I made to other people and keeping track of the signs they're making to be. And we seem to get along, and the things that I want to happen often happen, not always, but often happen because I had a successful kind of exchange of that kind. And so this is really kind of methodologically saying, use your capacity to reason about what a mind would want, right? And to engage in dialogue with that personality. Use that, which might be your greatest capacity as a human being, actually. It might be some, what we're best at, or close to what we're best at, is that capacity for dialogue. We're the social and communicating animal, and the animal that communicates with language and all of that. Use that capacity with respect to the entire world. But then, with the additional point that you need a methodological guidebook for that. Because if you just, took that principle and you're like, all right, the whole world is the expression of the will of a singular personality, go, figure it out yourself. What do you infer from that? Like every time you succeed at something, does that mean the personality wanted you to succeed? Every time you fail, does that mean he wanted you to fail? Does that mean every time you succeed at something, you should keep doing it, like you rob a bank and you get away with it, so rob another bank? Or is it more complicated somehow? Like, does he have, for example, mercy that prevents him from punishing you the first time you rob a bank, but he actually doesn't want you to rob banks? Or, does he have goals for you in your life that are different than your kind of primitive attempts at, trying this and trying that and seeing what you like and seeing what works, where you have a kind of a tradition that you can build on and you get a head start and you get some, guide rules and whatever. But the ultimate goal of that is to say, like, you're supposed to eventually feel like you're getting feedback, you're getting the chance to have dialogue with the personality that's running the world. And the way that you get to learn to do that is very incremental and very slow. And it's part of a process, and it's part of like buying into a whole methodology that you have to live in the midst of for years, and with study and with failure and with trying. So it's not easy to find out whether it works, but it presents itself as actually an empirically testable thing where it's like, walk this path for a year, for a decade, or whatever, and do it with sincerity and do it with study and with development, and seek the experience of encounter and dialogue. And maybe you'll start to understand the sense in which the book is using this word God, from the context of its usage in the text, and from the additional inferences that you get to make from what you observe and learn about the world. And that doesn't explain to you where God came from, right? Like it in fact assumes away that question at the outset and just said, you're not going to understand that. Don't bother asking that question. But you can empirically develop the same kind of confidence that he's there and has expectations of you that you first learned, your parents were there and they have expectations of you, which I think is very beautifully captured in this nice verse in Psalms from King David. Ki aviv emi azamoni v'Adonai lesfeni, that my mother and father have left me and the Lord has gathered me up. Like it's this, instead of just learning to talk to people like your parents in childhood, how about learning to talk to God in adulthood, and let that be a lifelong process?
Okay, very interesting. So that's definitely a take on the Torah that I haven't heard before, which I think is pretty is definitely well suited to like a scientific mind. I think, but it doesn't. I guess so. Your point is that it openly doesn't address the origin question, like the kind of like recursive issue. It kind of, rather than, whereas in science we kind of sweep it under the rug, at least in the Jewish religion, it's kind of left open intentionally, or kind of, it's explained only to the degree that you can write it down, but that's about it.
Yeah, I think I would split that into two pieces, because when we say origin, sometimes what we mean is just like, give me lots of details about what happened way in the distant past.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read the book of Genesis, that it does seem to provide a lot of that. So we have to talk about that in one set of terms, which I will in a second. But then there's like the existential question of, why is there something instead of nothing? Why are the rules of the world the way they are instead of some other way? That's the existential question, where there's always this infinite regress. And I think that in the Jewish tradition, that rolls into this notion of the transcendence of God, the unattainability, like you're never going to reach his level. And so there's some sense in which, although you can improve your understanding of him and your relationship with him, there will be things that can be known by him that will not be known by you. And that's, just part of the basis of your relationship. And there's things like that in the book of Job, for example, and this is in one of the books in the Hebrew Bible, where it's pretty explicit about that. It's sort of like God saying to Job, like, where were you when I set the foundations of the earth? Like, why do you think you should be able to see it all? And that doesn't mean we can't make progress in our understanding, and we can't both understand nature and the universe better, or also can't develop a deeper and more sophisticated relationship with God, or understand, the world through the lens of Torah more, but we shouldn't imagine it will complete the work. And so that's one aspect. But I think there is this other aspect of, well, if Origins is about just what happened a really long time ago, then what we run into is, well, there is a lot of stuff that the Bible, the Torah seem to be saying that sounds like it's trying to tell you an account of the past. So what's it doing there? And I think there the issue is more just, again, it's like, what is the proper use of the text? What language is it actually trying to speak to you? And I think that we get different things out of it by reading it different ways. The Jewish tradition has always seen this text as one that has shivim panim, like 70 faces, that you shouldn't be trying to get one meaning out of it. You should be trying to get all the meanings out of it. And obviously a text that's written for that purpose is going to be written differently than one that tries to be a dry forensic account that is like some kind of hyper detailed description of what you would have seen if you had a camera on the wall while all of this stuff was happening. That notion of the past and history, I think, is actually one that the Torah is very suspicious of, for reasons one could go into. Not to say that, you can't find things out or can't figure it out, but it's more like it always wants to know who's giving that account and what's his agenda, because it understands that telling the story of the past actually gives someone tremendous power, and that you should be asking what kind of power over people someone is seeking to attain by having control over how the story of the past is being told. And you shouldn't imagine that there's such a thing as a non-ideological account of the past. There's just different ideologies that will seek to tell you about the past in different ways. So that's kind of at the high level. And then explicitly, you could see this in the particular example where he's saying just like the 7 days of creation, it's like, well, was the earth created by God, or was the world or the universe created by God in 7 days, or wasn't it? Did that quote unquote actually happen, or didn't it? And then you look at the actual text and see what it's doing. And it's like, okay, day 1, light and dark. Day 2, upper waters, lower waters. Day 3, dry land and the seas, and plants growing on the dry land. Day 4, sun and the moon in the sky. Now, wait a minute. Day 3, plants. Day 4, the sun. All right, so you don't have to be Albert Einstein 3,000 years ago to realize that plants need the sun. And that's something people knew and have always known. So are we saying that the text just like was pulling a fast one, and it hoped no one would notice that the sun came on day 4, even though there were already plants on day 3? And then it's like, oh, actually, gotcha. We figured out that this is like scientifically unsound, even from the rudimentary perspective of a, farmhand on, some homestead millennia ago. No, I think what it's doing is it's showing you that its methodology is at the outset going to be one of provocations or contradiction, the presentation of puzzles. So what is it? Why is the sun on day 4 if planets are on day 3? And then you step back and you say, okay, well, let's look at all the days. Days 1, 2, and 3 is like light and dark, sea and land, plants, all these kind of background things. It's the stage. Days 4, let's skip over 4. Days 5, 6, and 7, that's birds and fish, and then there's land animals and people. And then the day 7 is about the Sabbath, which is about relationship between people and God. So the last 3 days, they're really about kind of the actors on the stage, the animals and the people, and their relationship with God. And then day 4 in the middle is the sun and the moon, which is just like time. It's just, counting the months and the years, which is explicit in the Torah. It says that what they're for is for keeping the holidays. So you have 7 days, and it's 3 on one side, that's the stage, 3 on the other side, that's the actors, and in the middle is time, right? The central day is the day that's about time. So it's even kind of showing you this sort of montage in which time is not progressing over the course of 7 days, really. Time is a day at the center of what's happening. So it's demonstrating to you in a sense that the account that it's giving has a structure that's different than a sort of dry blow-by-blow chronology, even if at another level it presents that way. And I'll say on top of that, the first commandment in the Torah that's given is about setting the month according to the moon. And so it's like at the center of creation is the first commandment given by God to man, hiding in plain sight. And also the sun and the moon are the predictable things in the world. So it's also saying that at the center is the mathematical predictability of nature. So it's this bundle of associations that are all basically signing different things to you about what you can understand, what it's possible to understand about what the created world is and what it's for. It's for God to serve man. It's for also, man to understand something about the nature of the world by looking at what's most predictable in it, such as the sun and the moon. And it's also, 6+1 is kind of fun from a physicist perspective because there are, 6 different space directions and 1 time direction. And we're even seeing that because we said there are 6+1 days and one of the days is about time. But instead of saying it's day 7, which is about time in one sense, it's like day 4, which is about time, in terms of the sun and the moon. So, it's really, there's the moment you open yourself to the possibility that the author of this text is much smarter than you and knows everything you could know and more, you see many different dimensions in it. And you quickly understand that although it uses the notion of chronology and history as a tool to tell the story so that the story can convey its message, that it is not playing the game of a paleontologist or a cosmologist. It is in a different mode. It is meant to be read and interpreted and understood in a different way. And that, I think, is not always necessarily understood by some people who read the Bible, very vehemently. Especially, I think we have a lot of centuries at this point of a back and forth between the Jewish world and the Christian world and the Islamic world, and sharing some of the same theological notions. And so there's a lot of confusion now about how the Hebrew Bible should be read. But I think you can make a pretty persuasive argument that the way the Talmudic sages were reading it is much more like the way it related to the text that I was just describing. And so going to them and be like, how can the Torah be true if, when we look at the cosmic microwave background, we see such and such? That would have just seemed to them like a stupid question. Because it would be obvious in a sense that these are not the same game for trying to make a reconstruction of the past, and they're not speaking the same language. So why would you expect them to align?
So another question, also like a somewhat philosophical question. So if you have like two perspectives, Western and Eastern, on kind of what's going on, in the sense that, I guess you could say the Western perspective is that they're different entities and they're kind of have some agency and they're doing something. Whereas the Eastern perspective is it's all one thing. So let's say we're having this conversation and you could say there's 2 entities talking to each other versus like a big mass of atoms that are just vibrating, and this is part of it, right? What's your, just thought, even on like a gut level, how do you feel about what's going on? Like, because it's really 2 interpretations of the same thing. You can draw the border anywhere you want, right? So what's your, kind of in your lived experience, what's your gut level feeling? Like, is it all one thing or is it a bunch of entities?
The way the Torah usually deals with interesting questions like this is to say both perspectives are necessary, and you have to find the right balance between them. So I think this is perhaps best captured by the signs that are given by God to Moses that he's supposed to bring to the Israelites when he's going to bring them out of Egypt. And these signs, 70 faces of the Torah, they contain a lot of different meanings, but one of them I think is very relevant to what you're saying. So there are 3 signs, because Moses is saying to God, like, I'm going to go to these people and they're not going to believe me. They're not going to listen to me. How do I show them that I'm coming from you with a message, from the creator of the world? And God says, okay, first of all, what is the stick that's in your hand? Throw it on the ground. And he throws it on the ground and it becomes a serpent. A nachash is the Hebrew word. And then he picks it up by the tail and it becomes a staff again. Then also, there's this sign where Moses' skin becomes kind of snowy white, and it's sort of like a disruption in his skin. It's called tzara'at in the Hebrew, and it is sometimes mistranslated as leprosy. But it's this thing that has meaning in Jewish law that's described in the book of Leviticus. And then lastly, he tells him to take the water of the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and it will become blood. So there's a lot of different meanings that these signs can have, but I think they definitely at least have a lot of meaning that pertains to exactly this question you're asking of, is the world a separable set of independent parts, or is it one whole? Because if you look at the first sign, it's about turning the staff into a serpent, okay? So what is a staff? A staff is a rod. It's a metrical, inanimate, dead, linear object that represents measurement and control and prediction. That, if I hold one point, one end of the rod, the other end will do what I expect it to. I can use it to measure. I can use it to do things in the world. It has no agency of itself. It's inanimate. If I let it fall, it will do nothing. And so from one perspective, you can look at the world and say it's all like rods. It's all just things that can be measured or things that are for measuring, and things that are inanimate and have no agency of their own. Then he throws it on the ground. And it doesn't become an elephant. This isn't just about a parlor trick, right? Like if this were just about impressing people, be like, God's on my side, I can turn sticks into elephants, then why not make it an elephant? God can do that according to the Torah just as easily as he can make it into a snake, right? He's the author of the world, so he's unlimited in what he can bring about. But that's not what it turns into. It turns into a serpent. What is the serpent? The serpent is two things. At least, first of all, it's the animal that looks just like a stick, right? So it is a shift in perspective on the same thing. So instead of seeing it as an inanimate thing, you see it as a thing that has agency and unpredictability. And not just that, because it's a serpent in the Bible, it's the animal from the Garden of Eden that talks, right? So it's also the possibility of like a voice, of hearing meaning in the unpredictability of experience, right? So that is the fundamental shift in perspective that is being presented, where it's saying, look at the world. Is the world a bunch of dumb, inanimate, manipulable materials that are just kind of bouncing around and you can make them do what you want and you can measure them and you can predict them and you can control them? Or if you cast that on the ground like a lot, you introduce the notion of uncontrollability and randomness to some degree. Is there agency in that world? Is there unpredictability that maybe even contains a kind of, a holism and a voice and the possibility of a dialogue? Is that there as well? And by the way, the word nechash in the Torah is a play on words, because the word nichush in the Torah means augury. It's like pagan attempts to predict the world using sorcery or whatever. So it's sort of, it's a bundle of ideas that comes together in the context of the Torah. And then you go to like the other signs that it's like his skin is all disrupted. The boundary between him and his surroundings is sort of like becoming anomalous. And, is he a separate thing? Is this human being a separate thing? Or is he a part of a whole? Is he connected to the whole? I'll say as an aside, and this was a theme in this book I wrote, Every Life is on Fire, that also is about these signs while talking about all the physics we were just discussing, because they also pertain to that. It's interesting that every one of these signs is about the boundary between life and non-life, right? The stick is dead, snake is alive. The skin is a disruption in the boundary of a living thing that sort of makes it anomalously unclear, like where the living thing begins and ends. And then turning, water on the dry ground to blood is going from non-life to life as well. But this disruption in him is like, if you're going to relate to the world as though it's a voice speaking to you, then, you're a part of that world. Like, are you lost in that whole? Like, how do you even, distinguish? Or if you're going to live your life with your hair on fire, looking for signs that everything is talking to you, how does one actually navigate that world? How does one experience it, and choose how to act, and deal along it? And are you just going to sort of meld and dissipate in that world? And then lastly, the blood on the dry ground is very much like that, because it's also the water of the Nile. So the Nile was like the whole world for the Egyptians. And to turn the Nile to blood is like saying the whole world is a living organism suffused by the flow of blood that connects it all. Blood is the thing that connects the whole organism to itself. So it's exactly this idea of the world as a whole instead of as a bunch of separable parts. And I think the point is that the Torah is saying you need to see the world as a whole that has meaning, that has possibly a voice that can speak to you so you can have a relationship with God on the one hand. And on the other hand, you also have to be careful, because if you really try to experience the world that way all the time, you might lose your mind, you might do the wrong thing, The Nachash, the serpent, is not just an animal that talks, it's the animal that tempts people into sin, right, in the Garden of Eden. Nihush, pagan augury, is a forbidden practice in the Torah. It says, don't do that.
This is like when they cut open the entrails of a sheep.
Yeah, that's why the battle, that sort of thing. So the Torah is trying to say, look, you need to be practical on the one hand. So the guys didn't give you a set of laws where in order to keep them, it's all about like, stay rooted in this world, be practical, solve your problems. If you need to, serve God by having wine for Friday night, service, then don't just expect wine to rain from the sky. You need grapes. You need to make the wine, go out and do in the world what the natural, predictable world makes available to you and figure it out and understand it so that you can serve God better on the one hand. And on the other hand, don't think that all this world is the materials and all this world is the mechanism, because then you'll just become self-involved and obsessed with your own power over it and, just trying to fix it and solve it for yourself. And you'll lose any sense of humility. You'll, lose any kind of attachment to morality over time and, various other concerns the Torah has. Principally, maybe the principal one is losing the opportunity to have a relationship with the world's creator and to see the world as a place where there's a voice that you can hear and that you can find communion and comfort and dialogue, through that. So, yeah, I think that the paradox in all this, you go back to Genesis, the beginning is like this, in this strange way, the Torah is being written as a story about the guy who created the whole world and has all the power and holds all the cards and is the author, where he's a character in the story of the Torah, but also where the story's happening in the world that he created, ultimately in part to help you start to look at yourself as a character in a story that's being written by God, in which he is also a character and with whom you can seek relationship. And that's not meant to be easy. And so it's not meant to be something where you can be like, oh, I get it. Okay, fine, I'm convinced. The process of being convinced is one that is lengthy and comes after committing to trying it out, which is, I think, the thing also that is really missing sometimes from like theological debates, is that this isn't something that, you resolve through argument sitting in a room before you decide what to do. You commit to a praxis, you live your life that way, you engage in study, and you progress in that development of an argument over a long period of time.
I think, that there's a quote from the Gulag Archipelago, like the Solzhenitsyn book about the gulags, like this 2,000-page compendium of like stories from the gulags. I think basically at some point, I don't remember if it's a quote in the book or he was asked this in an interview, but they asked him to like boil down the one sentence. What's the one sentence about the Gulag Archipelago? And he basically says that, the Russians essentially got rid of God and they got the gulags, something like that. I mean, this is not the direct quote. So I think there's definitely like there seems to be some kind of, that something like that happened in America in the, 70s, 80s, whatever, like roughly, God's been dead for a while since the 19th century, like with Nietzsche, but there's a big effort to get rid of God at some point in the 20th century. And definitely now you see, like, I almost see like even things like Burning Man in some ways are an attempt to return in some direction to a type of religious practice, and I've only been to Burning Man once, but you can definitely taste the same way that like people that are genuinely religious, like if you go, like the Jews, like I think the most religious Jews to me are always like the Hasids, because they feel very, they have like they're drinking like the high proof version of Judaism, they're like intoxicated with it, like you could really tell. And so Burning Man has some of that, right? So they have like the temple that they burn every year, and people will bring like photographs of like their family members who died and bring them to the temple and sit there and crying and so on. So there's definitely like this feel of like, but for sure, and I think maybe 50 years ago the opposite was true. Like people were trying to get away from these things, right? Now we're old and kind of lame, and my parents did this and whatever. And now it's becoming more vogue. But yeah, it's interesting to. I mean, part of that is also just like trying to grapple with how people interpreted all these religions before the 20th century, and what do they look like now, in light of kind of things that happened in the 20th century and things that we learned and so on. So it's really, I think it's fascinating to get your take on that. My last question, just that, we like to ask this because of, a lot of our viewers are scientists. So you've had a really diverse career. You were, super successful in science as a young man. You've worked in, in industry, leading a machine learning team at GSK. And obviously you also have like a pretty big hobby. You've become a rabbi. In parallel to all of that, like, well, do you have any advice? Like if somebody's, kind of has the personality type of a scholar or a scientist, like how do they go about, finding things to work on, making progress and so on?
My first reaction is I am afraid to give advice because I'm not sure I should be thought of as someone who necessarily knows what advice to give to someone else. Especially if it's like general advice. Often different people need different advice, and I feel like I trust in terms of, let's say, what I've learned in the last 15 years. I trust more what I've learned from the Torah than I trust what I've learned from my own life experience to guide me in that sense. So then if I'm going to say like, oh, the Torah says something, then I'm not sure I'm the one giving the advice. You learn from life experience, but you sometimes kind of can overgeneralize. And but with all that being said, I think that as far as like, if we're talking about having a career as a scientist, I think that there are different kinds of things you can decide you want to do in science, and some of them are more like you're trying to build real estate that's adjacent to other existing real estate, and become a part of a community. And then there are other times where maybe what you're doing is more like going out in the middle of a wilderness and planting a stake, and you kind of seem a little crazy, and you're trying to convince other people to realize the potential for where you are and where you're sort of trying to dig a foundation. And I think there's something healthy about going through periods of each of those things. And I think there's also something healthy in general about believing enough in someone else's vision for, what it's really exciting to understand or figure out, that you invest the effort in disciplining yourself to a way of thinking and, a set of methods that you have to learn, because you won't build skills that way. And at the same time, also, eventually, you often do some of your most fruitful and productive things by stepping away from that and taking a critical view and sort of asking what about what everyone else is doing is, hopelessly stuck in some way. And, can you do something different or a little more interesting by not making 100% of their assumptions and taking them for granted, but instead realizing either that, something about the approach they're taking, like, doesn't necessarily have to be valid, or that, you've realized you value something different about the research you're trying to do than what they've told you, should be valued. And I don't think there's like a single principle that you just go with that for your whole life. Part of what's interesting is, going through stages, giving yourself the chance to sort of germinate and develop in one setting, and sig roots a bit, but also having the willingness to also kind of be uprooted and try out a new setting. Like I certainly have ended up going through more stages and places in terms of my activities as a scientist than maybe I first expected. And I'm really glad for that. And I think that I've learned a tremendously greater deal. And also, it's helpful. Maybe the way I would put it, to summarize it and put it in language that is very easy to work with, coming from, let's say, the Bible or the Torah, is like, it's very healthy to have your idols shattered for you sometimes. And you can't quite ever avoid making idols for yourself, which is not to say you should do so on purpose consciously, but more like that it's in the human condition that even when you have the best of intentions and a lot of desire not to get kind of caught up in overly limited thinking, that will happen. And in some ways, it can be incredibly productive in the short term for that to happen, and maybe even kind of necessary. But that, making sure you have a point where you kind of lift your eyes from that and realize something is holding you in place or is overly simple, or being forced to see that shattered to some degree can be immensely productive if you embrace it, and overcome the difficulty of it and try new perspectives in addition.